Thank you. It's really fantastic to be here. I have to say, I find transition towns one of the most inspiring global movements in terms of the kinds of things that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So to be here in sort of TT mothership, as it were, is really exciting. So thanks very much indeed, Rob, for inviting me along, and hope to contribute to the discussions and the work that you're doing in the next hour or so. I am an architect, as Rob said, and I really spent a great deal of my life thinking about cities and designing cities as if they were like this. I've just picked the picture of Shanghai here. Lots of tall buildings, lots of energy buzzing around, transport systems, people dashing about doing important things in offices and so on. It's an extremely impoverished view of what a city is, but I now found it extraordinary that it was possible for me to study as an architect, practice as an architect, and teach for 20 years as an architect without the word food ever coming up once, because it didn't. It may have done notionally if we were sort of occasionally asked to design a market or something, but the fact that you can't have something like this, a sort of bricks and mortar city, without some kind of flip side, frankly never occurred to me. I won't bore you with the painful and long-winded personal journey that I went on in order to get from, as it were, the image I had in my head of a city to realise that this was also part of it. But once I'd had that realisation, it was like the world completely changed, and it really was a sort of one of those cliched overnight light bulb moments. And so to cut a very long story short, I gave myself the job of trying to describe a city through food. And I think what I was trying to do with that challenge that I set myself was trying to put the people and the ecology and, shall we say, the reality back into the discourse that I had been having about cities and architecture and urban design and so on. So here we have an example of one of the most destructive practices on the planet at the moment, large-scale monocultural production, often taking places in marginal areas like the Mato Grosso, adjacent to rainforest, which is also being destroyed, in order to produce food for these things that we call cities, with these extraordinary, these combine harvesters are actually being guided by a helicopter. And very often, it is not the case in this picture, but very often you'll see a phalanx of seed drills following on behind. So the land has about half an hour's downtime between the crop being harvested and the next lot being sown. This is a field of soya. It's actually being harvested not to feed humans at all, but to feed animals. Something like a third of the grain harvest globally goes to feed animals rather than humans, and it takes about 10 times as much grain to feed a human if it's been through an animal first, so it's an extremely destructive practice. But as I say, these kinds of landscapes are the flip side of the sort of unbridled urbanity that we've been indulging in, really, I would say, largely for the last 200 years, or since effectively the industrial age began. But it is a hidden relationship. It's one that we don't necessarily, I know I'm talking to a very special audience here, so when I say we, I'm talking about we, the vast majority of people in Western society or industrial society. I'm not really talking about you guys, because I think you probably are a special case. But anyway, if you'd allow me the more general we in the West we really don't think about cities in relationship with their productive hinterland at all. And it strikes me as a very odd thing, and I've really spent the last 10 years trying to wrestle with the problem of why we've got here, and also the even more in question of why, now that we've got here, what we're actually going to do about it. So to approach the why thing first, how is it possible that 50% of the planet and more now of us live in cities globally, and yet this idea of a city, the very concept of a city still remains, if you close your eyes and think of a city, you don't think of farms. That's not what you think of. You think of buildings and things like this. This is an image of Rome. It happens to be from the 15th century, but I still think it reflects the way we think about cities today. Very important place, full of very important, expensive buildings, highly symbolic, monuments. At this time, obviously, the centre of the Christian empire. Lots of, impressive brickwork and stonework and so on. And then this kind of amorphous bit of green dribble around the edge. which really doesn't look interesting at all. And I think this image really, for me, perfectly encapsulates what I call the urban-centric view of the world, which, however well-meaning we are, we have inherited. The culture we've inherited, the way of thinking about things, the written histories and so on, they are urban-centric. They're written from cities looking out. And it's just in the way that we're wired up to think. Cities have been centres of power, they've been centres of privilege, they've been centres of financial oomph. So there's a distorted vision that we've got of the relationship between the city and the countryside, and I use both of those terms very, very loosely because I'm going to go on to say that I think the word city and country or countryside need revision. We need to either get new words for what we're talking about when we say those things, or we need to rethink what we mean when we do say them. But this relationship, as I say, which is a very fundamental one, is not only seen from the city and it's sort of invisible to a lot of city dwellers, but it's also been historically and systematically distorted. And if you look at this image, it really sort of encapsulates that fantastically well. It looks like kind of, a lovely picnic on Hampstead Heath or something. But actually what it is an image of Highgate looking towards London. You can just see St Paul's Cathedral off there in the distance. You can tell it's a city because there's smoke rising. And it's actually an image from 1780. So just at the end of effectively 2.5 centuries of radical transformation of the landscape, known colloquially as the English Agricultural Revolution, which was stimulated by and ultimately in order to serve the exponential growth of cities in Britain at that time. And if you look at the landscape that you're seeing in this picture here, you can see there's been systematic enclosure of the land to make it more effective and more sort of easy to farm larger quantities. Of course, one can argue what effectiveness is in farming, but certainly in those days, going from strip farming, which was originally how people farmed, to these enclosed fields was, if you like, their enormous step towards efficiency of production. But there was a huge amount of rural depopulation, poverty, basically a complete dismantling, not only of the countryside, but also of rural lives in order to effect this transformation, in order to feed cities. And yet the view of it that we're presented with, which again is an urban-centric one, is, as I say, of a kind of lovely picnic. You see peasants with velvet hats on and people, sort of lolling about in the hedgerows as the harvest comes in. A complete distortion, a sort of pastoral fantasy, in fact, of the very harsh reality of living in the countryside at that time. So you've got William Cobbett storming around on his horse, sort of saying, cities are evil wens and they're going to destroy the world. And at the same time, you've got images like this saying, oh, isn't it all pretty? So we have the invisibility of the countryside as seen from the city, and we also have fantasies about the reality of the productive hinterland necessary to feed the city. And it gets more extreme as the city continues and industrializes, because at this stage, which is only about 40 or 50 years later, we sort of early to mid 19th century, cities are starting to get very big and very unmanageable and very smoky and very dirty and very crowded. And a lot of people are beginning, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a classic example, are beginning to say that cities themselves are evil, that progress has been a terrible mistake, and that we've got to get back to nature. We've got to rediscover the noble savage, as it were. And people start scouring the landscape for places they can be noble savages, ironically, including places like this, Yosemite National Park, which actually was inhabited by the nearest thing they had at that time to noble savages, in other words, Native American Indians who lived there, and it in fact had created the landscape, had been living there and coppicing, and sort of herding deer and so on, but they were kind of forcefully removed in order that Yosemite could be turned into a temple of sacred nature, untouched by human hand. And this transformation was actually effected in order to create this beautiful image of, if you like, nature as an idyll, but crucially unproductive nature, not productive nature. And at the same time that we're worshipping this unproductive nature, productive nature, shall we say, turns into this kind of thing, factory farming. In other words, it becomes the kind of thing that people no longer really want to paint or write poems about. It goes into factories, it goes indoors, it denatures, in fact. And so we have a completion of the split that I'm talking about between the urban view of nature and the reality of the productive hinterland necessary to feed a city. This is actually an image from Cincinnati in 1830, so it's roughly contemporary with that painting you just saw. And it's Cincinnati was really the first major meatpacking centre in the USA, known as Porkopolis because a number of pigs processed there every year. And it's a ruthless process of basically a 6-story high building in which the animals were marched up to the top. They were killed on the top deck, and then gravity was used to sort of bring the body parts down through all the various processes, eventually sort of rendering the fat down and so on, and sort of colloquially using every part of the animal apart from the squeal. So I'm really sort of saying that through this 200 or 300 year period, there's been an interesting shift from, if you like, a fantasy about the reality of farming to the complete invisibility, the disappearance of it, and a complete schism in the urban view of the sort of its other half in what resides in something we might call countryside, although by the time it's turned into this, countryside clearly isn't the right term anymore. Of course, meat production and places like Cincinnati literally evolved because of the growing demand for meat in growing cities. There is a direct relationship between the number of people living in cities and the amount of meat consumed. This is for various reasons. One is that meat has always been a very privileged food in the West, at least. It's always been far more expensive and difficult to produce than other foods, so only rich people could afford to eat a lot of it. And also, basically, when people moved into cities and the industrial process took place, the demand for it rose because people needed a high-protein diet in order to withstand the kind of work schedules they were being required to complete in factories and so on. The thing is that actually the way we produce meat today hasn't changed all that much. I mean, yes, we're marginally nicer to the animals some of the time, but it remains the case that, there's a ruthless efficiency to this kind of process, and also these places are invisible. I mean, they're very, very difficult to get in to see. You ring one of these factories up and say, hello, I'm writing a book about food in cities and I'd love to come and see your meat factory. You don't get immediately booked in to the diary. You get shoved on to sort of, the administrator who's away on a 5-year-long holiday. They're like military installations. They're very, very difficult to get into. So there's an extraordinary netherworld, is what I'm really saying, to feeding cities that the vast majority of food consumers and city dwellers never get to see. And as I said, there is a direct correlation between meat consumption and city dwelling, and in fact the United Nations has pronounced the world to be in the grip of a livestock revolution, predicting that there's going to be double the amount of meat and dairy eaten in overall in the country, in the world, by 2030. And there's also going to be double the number of people living in cities. So there's a huge crisis that we're facing really in terms of not only people moving to cities but also what they're consuming. Especially, as I said earlier on, that actually it's so ecologically difficult to produce meat, and the fact that we're now feeding grain to animals which we could be eating ourselves. So an enormous issue. And in fact, again, I mean, this is the kind of the scary statistics bit, but again, the kind of thing that, Rob and Transition Towns are doing is all to do with this context, which I really see through food, which is the extraordinary damage that we're wreaking on the globe globally by producing food in the way that we do, in the unconscious way that we do. So, 19 million hectares of rainforest, last time I looked, being destroyed, a lot of it in order to either produce grazing for cattle or to produce soya fields like the ones I showed you to feed cattle, or palm oil indeed, which goes into biscuits under the innocuous sounding title of vegetable oil. But a similar amount of existing farmland being eroded because of monocultural production, because it exhausts the soil so quickly. Hugely, I don't have to tell this group of people about the number of calories that go into every calorie of food we produce, but it's basically hugely oil hungry. And of course, because we've externalized all the true costs of food, and I haven't even got into water shortages and all of that, or human and animal exploitation. But it remains the case that cheap food is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. And the illusion of cheap food has been created by externalizing its costs. But because we've externalized its costs, we've put them elsewhere in the budget, as it were. We have this idea that food is cheap and therefore we don't value it and therefore we waste it. So, as I say, half the food in the USA wasted, and of course the UK is not far behind. And finally, of course, the system doesn't work anyway because 1 billion, roughly, worldwide are overweight, a third of those obese, and a similar number hungry. And again, that number fluctuates alarmingly every time there's a climate change-related event like the Russian harvest failure recently because of drought. So it's an awful system, it's unsustainable, we can't go on feeding ourselves like this. As I said, I've got 2 questions tonight. One is, how did we get here? And the second is, what are we going to do about it? I'm going to do a bit more of the how did we get here stuff before I get on to the what do we do about it? That's all right. So how did we get here? And it does really go back to this whole business of, why did we build cities in the first place? What is a city? Why do we live in these things? Is there a better way of living? The beginning of it all really sort of goes back 10,000 years or so to the end of the last ice age. The ice receding northwards, and basically all the animals that people used to live by hunting and chasing backwards and forwards go north with the ice, leaving effectively a very verdant area, which is crescent-shaped, hence it's called the Fertile Crescent, and in fact it was the model for the Garden of Eden, as it says in all the books that are propping up the projector here. But and here were naturally occurring grasses that were the ancient antecedents of modern wheat and barley. And as I say, there's a lot of very hungry people wandering around wondering where all the woolly mammoth had gone. And they eventually began to experiment with eating grain. This had never been done before. Obviously, grain is static. It comes to fruition at a particular time. In order to harvest it, you have to be near it. So people began camping close to these grasses. And then they kind of mashed them up into a hideous-looking porridge. And then obviously sort of got better at keeping the seed and resowing it, and then building slightly bigger settlements, farming settlements like Jericho, about 8,000 years BC, and eventually evolving into fully blown cities, static settlements next to a food source that for the first time in history was both stationary, I wasn't moving around or migrating, and relatively predictable, and also capable of creating a food surplus. In other words, it was capable of sustaining a non-food producing population, i.e. I'm talking about farming, obviously, I'm talking about agriculture, but I'm also talking about urbanity. And really what I'm trying to say with this rather long-winded explanation of the Fertile Crescent is that here you have the joint and combined and sine qua non symbiotic evolution of urbanity and agriculture. And in fact, grain is the only food that we've ever come up with that's capable of feeding an urban population. So grain is the food of cities, always has been, always will be until somebody comes up with a magic pill. And it still is, of course, despite the fact that, as I was saying, people moving to cities tend to eat more meat. Of course, they're not really eating meat. They're eating grain. They're just passing it through an animal first. So those early cities, I mean, there's some interesting things about them. They were very compact. This is one of them, from 2000 BC. Look at that, that's 400 meters. I mean, I don't know how big Totnes is across, but I mean, this is small. Anyway, Rob's writing, but he probably doesn't know how many meters Totnes is across anyway. But we're talking about a very, very compact, small, limited in size city, absolutely jam-packed with little houses. That's just give you an idea of the texture. They hadn't excavated it all, but it's literally full of houses, very little open space. And in the middle, a large temple complex, which in fact was not only the spiritual centre of the city, but also the grain administrating centre. In other words, the temples organised the harvest. It was all obviously to do with festivals organised throughout the year that mirrored the agricultural seasons and so on. The grain was gathered in, it was offered to the gods, in the famous ziggurat of Ur, and then the food that the gods didn't eat was stored in this enormous municipal granary and then distributed to the people throughout the year. So really, you can see the temple of Ur as a kind of vast, centralized, spiritualized food distribution hub, effectively. And this is true of all cities in the ancient world, including Rome, which was also politically absolutely dependent on its grain supply. The only interesting thing about Rome, of course, as ancient cities go, is that unlike which was small and compact, Rome was vast and sprawling, with something like up to 1 million citizens by the 1st century AD. How on earth did a city this size feed itself in the ancient world? And the answer is what I call ancient food miles. I know Tim Lang came up with that nomenclature a few years ago, but actually food miles are not a new thing. In fact, Rome couldn't have fed itself were it not for the fact that it had access to the Mediterranean and a very large military force capable of making sure that nobody else got a hold on the trade in the Mediterranean. And it effectively sequentially waged war on neighbouring states in order to get its hands on their grain supplies critically, but also their other reserves of food. So it began with Sardinia and Sicily. This is in about the 1st century BC, then wages war on Carthage, eventually conquering Egypt, and thereby securing its most critical grain supply, which was coming in by ship, obviously. And this is critical, the fact that it was on water, because it would have been impossible to ship this amount of food around had it been overland. In fact, there was a practical limit of about 20 miles for getting grain across rocky terrain. I mean, yes, the Romans were good at building roads and everything, but if you imagine a wagon load of grain, you know, a few oxen up front, kind of large boulders on the streets and wooden wheels, you know, with metal rims, I mean, that's a pretty slow and painful way of getting food in to feed 1 million people. No, it was Alexandrian grain ships, which were the sort of the super tankers of their day. People used to kind of line up on the dockside in Ostia, Rome's main port, and kind of look for the grain ships, because a bit like the UK today, Rome was only ever about a week secure in its food supplies. It was always running right at the limit of running out. Of course, if it did run out, the citizens rioted and so on. So really, you can look at the expansion of the Roman Empire as a kind of vast militarized shopping spree, really. You know, it just kept expanding, and as it ran out of places to get food from. And as you can see, I mean, the variety of foods, I mean, we've all heard about kind of exotic animals coming up from Africa, but, you know, liquamen, which is a kind of fermented fish sauce, which the Romans were obsessed with, that was from southern Spain. They were even importing oysters from Britain, so a huge appetite. And really the point about this is that, you know, the only way Rome could have fed itself was by being the only big city in really a vast reach of the world. And in fact, no city grew as big again until London in the early 19th century. So that just gives you some idea of what an extraordinary thing it was that it fed itself at all. So what I'm really saying is that if we're looking at this business of how cities feed themselves, we've got a number of things we have to think about. We have to think about how the food is produced. We have to think about how it's transported. That's the next problem. Rome solved it by annexing the sea. And the first person that really sort of analysed this in detail was a German geographer and landowner called Johann von Thünen, who in 1826 wrote a book called The Isolated State, which doesn't sound very promising, but in fact what the isolated state was, and it's illustrated by this diagram on the left here, it was a featureless, ubiquitous, fertile plain inhabited only by logical, profit-seeking farmers. So it's a strange place, doesn't exist obviously, but I mean, he posited if you had a city, represented by this pink blob here, sitting in the middle of such a landscape, how would its food hinterland naturally distribute itself? And he said, well, obviously, right close to the city you would have fruit and veg growing, because it's very difficult to transport fruit and veg, they get squashed, they go off, blah, 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 blah. Also, fruit and veg were a luxury food, so the farmers could charge big markups so they could afford the rents right by the city. You then got a band of firewood for fuel, obviously, and then roughly a 20-mile band of grain production because, as I was saying earlier, it was so difficult to transport grain a further distance overland. That more or less limited the distance you could go to, which of course limited the size of the city. And then the outer band, livestock grazing, because all the animals could walk into market, so they could provide their own transport, although they lost a lot of weight on the way, so they had to be fed up again in the suburbs, which they very often were on spent grain from breweries and so on. So this was his kind of, I have to say it's a post-analysis of how cities were fed because it pretty much mirrors what was kind of going on outside his window at the time. His one concession to geography was to say that if the city was on a navigable river, then you could extend all of those distances because it was so much easier to bring the food in by river. So, you know, all the bands, as it were, start slewing out sideways, if that makes any sense. And even if it doesn't make any sense, it's still what happens. Anyway, so, what's interesting, as I say, is much more interesting, I have to say. I was taught von Thunen at school, and I just couldn't see the point, but it's interesting how these things come back and bite you in the back of the leg years later. Anyway, it's much more interesting if you actually apply it to a real place. And in my case, my hometown, London, slightly bigger than Totnes at the moment, but you know, you never know. Anyway, and you can see this all sort of actually taking place, and you can also see the effect that it has on the city. So obviously London is a city on a navigable river, so it's able to bring in its food from the sea right into the middle of the city, which had a profound effect and still does, in fact, on our attitude to feeding ourselves, which is interesting, and we can discuss later if you've got time. Anyway, if you look closely at this map from 1801, you can see all the market gardens that von Thunen sort of post-dicted. He didn't really predict them because they were already there. But anyway, all the market gardens in the city suburbs, as predicted. And then if you look at the way London's food was coming into the city, you can again see how the journey of food and the nature of food itself was shaping the city and the life in the city. So if we look at this map of London from 1676, which is 10 years after the Great Fire, and in fact the first properly accurately drawn map of London, the Ogilvy map, fantastic map, brilliant detail on it, love it. I've got a big copy of it at home, which I look at when I haven't got a life. What you can see here is London, of course, was originally a Roman encampment, and you can still see the classic northwest, southeast axes of the Roman town here. This was the site of the Roman Forum, which of course was also London's Roman food market. There was also Bermondsey in the south. But also, you know, you can see Leadenhall Market, which still trades as a market today, is on the site of the old Roman Forum, and there's been a market there for 2,000 years, as there has in Bermondsey, which isn't on this map because the south of the river didn't burn down in the fire, so Ogilvy didn't bother to draw it when it all got built up again. But anyway, it's quite important and it's down there. But London Bridge was the only north-south crossing of the river until the mid-18th century, so there was a very important axis. Market, obviously, in the middle. Cheapside was London, medieval London, and early modern London's main market. So effectively the food for London, which you can see it's turning into fields already there, so you're looking at really the main body of the city in this picture. The food is trying to get here, it's trying to get into the centre of the city, which is where it's most accessible so people can walk to it and buy it and so on. So the grain, the most important food of all, is coming in by river because it's heavy and bulky and difficult to transport. So it's coming in at the two river ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate, and then, as it were, it's making its way into the centre. Although on the way, what's interesting is that the streets that it travels up to get physically into the middle of the city become grain markets in their own right. So both the river ports were grain markets, and also this street called Bread Street was one, as you can tell from its name. And then the grain makes it up to the main market, and also to Cornhill, which again you can tell, retains its name today, and you can tell was the site of the Corn Exchange. And in fact, I have to say, you can analyse any pre-industrial city by just looking at street names and sort of reading the names of food off the map. You can tell, you can see how the food was travelling into the city. So that's grain. Obviously fish is also coming in by river. Obviously again at the two main river ports. Queenhithe leading up to the main market at Cheapside. You can again tell from the street names. Friday Street was obviously where you went to buy your fish on a Friday when the eating of meat was forbidden and so on, as it was for many years. Billingsgate clearly still operating as a market until the 1980s, famously. So again, another example of the incredible longevity of food once it's established in a city. And then, of course, meat is not coming in by river, it's walking in. So you have a completely different disposition of the food route and also the positions of the markets. A lot of London's meat came from Scotland and Wales, what Adam Smith called unimproved pasture. In other words, kind of good but cheap grass, didn't have to do anything to it, just dump the animals on it and they get on with it. So it's coming in mainly from the northwest. The animals would walk, up to 500 miles and they'd arrive in the outskirts of the city. They'd be fattened up again, a specialist profession in the suburbs, and then they'd come in originally to Newgate in the northwest, and then when that wasn't big enough, to Smithfield, which was a big smooth field just outside the gate. And I have to point out always, even when I haven't got time, which I never have, that poultry, which retains its name to this day, got its name because all the turkeys and geese for London were bred in the northeast, in East Anglia and so on. So the animals, the birds would sort of waddle in with little leathered shoes to protect their feet and come in. And when they hit the east end of Cheapside, that's why they were sold, hence poultry. So you can see how food was literally physically shaping the city, where cities could be built, where food was available, how it was travelling in, and so on. And of course, that was very palpable in the city itself. If we look at this image of Smithfield from 1830, you can tell, because it was a livestock market, nobody living in a city like this could have been in any doubt as to where their food came from. If you were going to eat Sunday lunch and it was going to be a roast, the chances are it would have been mooing or baaing or bleating outside your window just a few days earlier. So, the reality of the consumption, particularly of foods like meat, was extremely visible. Of course, cities were also very noisome places. Of course, slaughtering had to take place in the city, so squeamishness wasn't an option. Something like 184 unregulated slaughterhouses, mainly in basements in all of these houses around Smithfield, up until the 1840s. So it gives you some idea of, in fact, fantastic descriptions in books like Oliver Twist of a journey through Smithfield and just how visceral this experience was. But there's no question, if you lived in a city at this time, that you would have been aware of its, shall we say, organic quality. It was inescapable. So markets were very key spaces for many reasons. They were often the only open spaces in the city. You had to go there because they were often the only places you could buy fresh food. The reason for that was that city authorities were so aware of the importance of the food supply that it was extremely highly regulated. It was illegal to build food shops away from food markets. So they were literally the place you had to go to buy fresh food. It was all sold in the open so it could be regulated and no dirty dealing could go on, which of course it did anyway, but never mind. But also they were centres of getting together, places to go and chat, to find out what the news was, to celebrate, to gossip, to see other people. They were hugely social spaces. And in fact, my favourite image of a marketplace is this one. It's the Bruegel battle between Carnival and Lent, painted in 1556. Carnival, of course, the celebration of all the pleasures of the flesh, the carnal pleasures, just before they're all going to have to be given up for Lent. So you can see the figure of Carnival here, big fat bloke, with a pig on his poke and very well endowed. He obviously enjoys all the carnal pleasures, and a pie on his head, sitting on a barrel of beer, fighting off this miserable looking old hag, with a couple of pathetic fish on her palate and so on. She represents, well, in fact, it's a he dressed up in a dress, but you get the idea. Basically, the misery of fasting that's going to come. And of course, Lent always won the battle, and then the city went into its 4 weeks of fasting. But then, of course, that was then broken by Easter, and what we're actually seeing here is one of the old agrarian rituals Christianized and brought into the Christian city, because it's still actually reflecting the agricultural seasons. So really, this is my kind of this is what where we got to in the pre-industrial city with food slide, because I'm going to sort of move on to my sort of and then the trains came bit. Because really do, it is a cliche, but things really do change overnight when the trains come. And you can see why. Here's an image of the Great Western Railway in 1840. Look what it's carrying. all those mooing and bleating and baaing animals that, up until last week, as it were, would have been walking into Smithfield are now being transported by rail, which means that they can be slaughtered out of the city and brought in as meat because they can be kept fresh, because they can be transported quickly. So overnight, and it really is a very, very quick transformation. I'll stop saying overnight, but sort of very, very quickly in the space of a few years. Several things happen with the coming of the railways. One, cities are no longer constrained by geography, which they have been radically up till that point, because they can suddenly get food in from a lot further afield. Two, food is no longer occupying the same spaces as humans. In other words, animals start to travel, for instance, in special carriages. They arrive at night, they go into depots, you don't see them anymore, so food becomes invisible. And three, city authorities, which up till then had been absolutely, kind of monitoring the food supply like nobody's business, suddenly thought, gosh, it's got so much easier all of a sudden, I can concentrate on which is my best side, and they just give up the ghost on regulating food. So it basically passes at this point into commercial hands. And these are three very, very profound changes which we're still dealing with today. First, the kind of unconstrainedness of a city or its emancipation from geography. Here is London in 1840. That is the extent of the map we were just looking at from 1676. So in nearly 200 years, the city's barely grown at all. In 60 years, I won't say overnight again, well, it's kind of got a lot bigger, hasn't it? And by 1929, basically this is no longer a city you could possibly service by one market that everybody walks to. It's just not going to happen. So we'd have a complete sort of explosion of city building. Of course, I'm leaping on now to include the car, which really just builds on from everything the railways started. We have these things that, we have to really discuss. And in fact, believe me, architects spend, years sort of debating whether we can really call this a city or not. Who cares? It's a large area where people are living where they're not producing food. It's the same problem. And in fact, it's a much bigger problem because not only would not anybody in their right minds walk to buy anything in a landscape like this, but as we know, and Fritz Haig very entertainingly keeps pointing out, all of this land that could be used to produce food is actually just used to kind of have, heavily watered lawn on. Anyway, obviously, if you live in a place like this, you have to have a car, you have to have a fridge, and you come home from the shopping with this kind of pile of boxes with stuff in that you don't smell and you don't touch and you don't feel and you don't understand. You read the labels, you wonder what it is, you shove it in the fridge and it goes off. It really is, the beginning of our disconnection with food and what it is. And of course, we're still there today, to sort of give me a PhD and I might read you a food label sort of thing. And of course, the things that used to be in the centre of the city, the market, the core of the city, its sociability, its identity, its politics, its celebration, its everything, has been replaced by large boxes on the outskirts of cities that we drive to get our food. It's a complete reversal of the whole logic of having a city in the first place. Cities were built, they were originally there so you could kind of harvest a very handy new food crop called grain, but very quickly they evolved into sort of places to meet and barter and trade and so on. When we've emptied out the essence of that, because food was always the most immediate and vital part of that, and dumped them in boxes outside the city, which, by the way, have been specifically designed and invented to exclude the human. And that's what supermarkets are. Supermarkets are trying to replicate all the functionality of markets with none of the humanity. That's what they do. It's weird. And of course, this is what's happened to celebration and vitality and gossiping with your neighbour and celebrating the agrarian change of seasons. Essentially, from autumn to Christmas, the only difference is the bloke's got a red sweater on. Otherwise, it's the same white van. And of course, as we know, in order to withstand the bizarre food distribution and production systems that we've evolved to feed these bizarre, enormous, sprawling, non-productive cities, we have to put, we don't have to actually, but the naughty food companies have anyway, put all sorts of bizarre products into the food so that it can sort of stay fresh on a shelf for 3 months until somebody wheels past in a fat buggy to pick it up. So we have extraordinary things in food, under the innocuous sounding label of vegetable oil, as I was saying earlier, that are actually palm oil, known in the trade as tree lard, because it's got a higher saturated fat content than butter. So we're getting fat. I mean, it's a huge issue, because food is not food anymore. It's not food, most of it. Certainly in the middle aisles of the supermarket it isn't. Anyway, and the world is turning into a hamburger, essentially. That's my shorthand for what's going on. Because globally, control of the food system, it's all moving in this direction. And there are various reasons for this, as I said. Supplying cities with food is an enormously lucrative business. Well, in fact, control of the food supply, as ancient city authorities knew, is power. Control of food is power. We have to eat. So if you control food, you control the people that have to eat. There's a huge amount of money to be made from feeding people, particularly value-added food. There's much more money in feeding people Pringles than there is in feeding them a raw potato. There's almost no money in feeding them a raw potato, as many farmers know to their chagrin. But, pulverise it, add a whole load of weird stuff like MSG, shove it in a tennis ball packet and sort of flog it for 800 times the amount that you would have got for potato, and bingo, big business. So anyway, lots to say about that, but the world's turning into a hamburger, so we have a real problem globally. There's enormous consolidation within the food industry. Something like between 60 and 90% of global trade in grain, for instance, is controlled by just 3 multinational companies. There are unacceptable levels of control of very essential foodstuffs by completely unelected and largely invisible corporations. And of course, as I say, because this kind of diet, for various reasons, is what's going global, and it is partly to do with the fact that it's seen as kind of the modern diet, bizarrely, even in places like Asia. We've got a growing problem. So we've got here, that's bad and it's unsustainable, so what are we going to do about it? Maybe the more positive side of my talk. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but should I just plough on? Good, thank you. That was the right answer. I didn't look when I started, I'm normally quite good at that. Anyway, the first thing to say about this enormous question, what are we going to do about it, is that it's not a new question. In a way, that's the good news. In fact, there is a history about as long as there is a history of city building in people saying, how the heck are we going to keep this thing going? It's never been easy, right back from ancient Mesopotamia onwards. So without dragging you through 5,500 years of people wringing their hands in despair, I'll just give you the last 500 years or so. So this is Thomas More's Utopia, written in the mid-16th century as a critique of the London of his time, which he thought was corrupt, unsustainable, actually, because he thought it was, exploiting the countryside to ruin. He was right, it's just ahead of his time. And he couldn't criticise Henry VIII openly because he'd have his head chopped off. So instead he invented this fantasy island that a Portuguese mariner had, I don't know why Portuguese, but anyway, make it even sort of less to do with him, had accidentally stumbled upon. And he said there was this kind of island paradise, really, where there were a series of self-sufficient city-states, little compact cities surrounded by productive farmland, arranged in a kind of network about a day's walk away from one another, where everybody was farming mad, basically. Farming was the one activity that men, women and children all took part in. They all were obliged to spend 2 years of their lives farming, but people loved it so much they just did more anyway. And they all had kind of gardening competitions to see who could grow the biggest marrow, a bit like, Wallace and Gromit and the Were-Rabbit sort of thing. If any of you have seen that, but, sort of killer sort of, garden competitions. And they were really food obsessed. He doesn't kind of go on and on about the food thing, but if you read Utopia with food in your head, it's all there. Anyway, so that was Thomas More's Utopia, a fantasy island where people were kind of food obsessed. And it's very interesting because if you look at a lot of utopian projects through the years, and actually Plato does the same thing. Plato sits down and he says, what is the ideal society? And he comes up with his republic, and he worries about how big should it be, and he does a lot of maths, and he comes out with a figure of, maybe about 30,000 citizens. As it happens, each of those citizens had 5 dedicated slaves kind of looking after them. We won't go into that, but anyway, 30,000 citizens. But if you look at Ebenezer Howard's Garden City model from 1902, it's exactly the same idea. It really is Thomas More again. So he says, what we need, well, he actually talks about the town and the country. He talks about, cities and countryside having benefits and disbenefits. And he says, the great thing about cities is there's lots of people around, lots of opportunity, sociability. He says the trouble is, nature is excluded. So we don't want that. On the other hand, if you live in the countryside, beautiful nature and open air and healthfulness and so on, but lack of sociability, lack of opportunity. So his garden city is really an attempt to sort of bring the two things together and say, how can we get the best out of city living and country living in one package and exclude all the bad bits? And this is his answer. And as I say, it's very like Thomas More's Utopia. So we've got a series of self-sufficient city-states of limited size, 30,000 inhabitants with 2,000 farmers, dedicated farmers. They're all arranged in a network. I mean, in Thomas More's day, it was a day's walk. In Ebenezer Howard's day, it's a half-hour train ride. But same idea. You've got a network of people that can sort of support one another, and yet individually they've got a lot of local access to nature. And he says, he defines urbanity as the ability to have enough people within about half an hour's journey of each other that you can sustain a decent symphony orchestra, which I think is probably as good a definition as any, so I'll go with that. Anyway, so that's what the Garden City was, and here's his what he calls the three magnet model, just making that clear, the town, the country, the good bits, the bad bits, and how you can sort of resolve them by having as he calls it, town-country magnet. He even got to build one. This is incredible. It's interesting what you're doing in Totnes, because you're sort of building, I wouldn't say it is utopian, I'll come on to that in a second, but I would say, you're doing what you're doing from the inside out in a way, incrementally. It's very unusual for a vision like this to get, plonked somewhere and built from new. But that is what happened in Letchworth Garden City. He got the backing of some fantastic, the big industrialists of the time. He got the Bournevilles, he got the Leverhumes, all the big industrialists to put money into the Garden City concept. They bought 6,000 acres of land in Hertfordshire. They got the best architects of the day, Parker and Unwin, to sort of design a kind of, beautiful country sort of esque arts and craftsy aesthetic. Started building. And then at the last minute, all the big industrialists said, oh, hang on, there's just one bit maybe we won't bother to do, which is all that bit you said about putting the land in trust for the city so that it could sort of be in perpetuity, sort of fed back into municipal works and so on. Maybe we'll just flog it off to the people that want to live there. So in fact, what they ended up creating was not a garden city at all, but suburbia. That's what it is. It's suburbia. It's just a very, very nicely built suburbia to an unusually high spec. And the deep irony is that if you talk to people about garden cities generally, that's the image that comes into their head. It's not a radical, incremental land reform movement, which is what Howard originally intended it to be, full of self-sufficient, semi-autonomous city-states. It's suburbia. Anyway, there you go. And that, in fact, is the problem with utopia. Because if you look at the word and what it actually means, it's a special joke that Thomas More deliberately chose in order to sort of protect himself even more from having his head chopped off for criticising Henry VIII. Didn't work in the end, by the way, and he got it chopped off anyway, but that was over some other argument. Anyway, it's got a double derivation. It can either mean a good place from the Greek word oiou for good and topos for place, or it means no place from the Greek word ou, no, and topos, place. In other words, utopia is great, but you can't have it. Now, I think that's problematic because I think, if you look at the history of trying to think how we should dwell better, utopia is the best tradition we've got. It's multidisciplinary, tries to look at the whole picture, tries to be specific. Many people have tried to build them, always failing, by the way. But actually, it's inherently flawed because it aims at perfection, and perfection, as we know, is not human. It's godlike if God exists, but it's certainly not human. So I think we need a new multidisciplinary way of thinking about how we live. So I'm going to propose to you Zootopia, which means food place, from the Greek word sitos for food and topos for place. Now, the reason I'm proposing this is because I think we already live in Zootopia. I think we already live in a world shaped by food, far more than we realise. I know we realise it generally when we look at our, tummies just after Christmas, but, it's much, much bigger than that. It's global. It really is the whole, journey of food through the city. Every aspect of our lives at every scale, I believe, is shaped to some degree or other, and in many ways, in a very primary way, by food. So we already live in Zootopia. We just live in a really bad one because we live in one that we haven't designed. We live in one that's kind of just happened while we were looking the other way. So the trick, I think, is to realise how profoundly food is shaping our lives and to use it to shape our lives better. So how do we do that? Well, here's one good example from, in this case, 550 years ago, roughly. Have I got my maths right? No, 650 years. Anyway, this is from 1338. It's Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. I didn't put allegory on there because I couldn't fit it on. But, and it's basically an image of Siena, a sort of very successful medieval Italian city-state. And this is just a detail of it, by the way. There's a lot more on either side. But this fresco decorates one side of the Sienese town hall, and it sits on the opposite side of the effects of bad government, which I can't show you because it's largely been destroyed, probably metaphorically correctly. But anyway, here we have good government. And essentially you can see a very well-tended countryside. I mean, actually, if you look out of the window of Sienese town hall now, it looks pretty much like this. Beautifully tended olive groves and vineyards, huntsmen leaving the city to go out foraging, very sort of industrious-looking farm workers. They were actually liberated peasants. This was a new thing that Italian city-states did at this time. They actually allowed peasants to become crop sharers, which made them far more industrious. And then animals entering the city with grain on their backs, fluffy sheep wandering around, women with baskets of eggs on their heads and so on. So, of course, me with my food-shaped goggles, all I see is food. And it is really about food, actually. It's about the relationship between the city and the country. This fundamental, symbiotic relationship that I've been talking about for the last, I don't know how long, and I dread to think. But effectively, it's all played out through food. Food is the connective tissue, if you like, the connective medium. And the message is very simple. If the city looks after the countryside will look after the city. That's just basic. As I say, it's called the Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. So it sort of does what it says on the tin, really. So as I say, that's the closest I know to an image of what Zootopia might look like, but let's not get too utopian about Zootopia, because in fact, Zootopia is explicitly not utopian, which means it can be any size, any shape, compromised, here and now. It doesn't have to be this grand vision. And in fact, it's all about this cycle that I've really been talking about in bits and bobs so far tonight. I've been talking about food production. That's got to come from somewhere. Let's call it, for the sake of argument, the countryside. It's then got to travel via, these days, quite often a factory or regional distribution centres, but let's just call that a road or a railway or a river. Then it's got to come into the city. Obviously, not all food arrives in cities, but I'm really talking about a sort of fundamental relationship between city and country here. So let's say it arrives at least in a sort of human settlement of some kind, gets bought and sold, then sometimes gets cooked, although as we know 1 in 3 meals in Britain is actually cooked at that point. So it kind of arrives, ready cooked, and of course doesn't go to a market, it goes to a supermarket, but same idea. It's then eaten, goes into the waste system, and somehow ends up in what we'll loosely call countryside again. And that's effectively the urban food cycle. And if you like, the city loosely occupies that part of it, and the countryside loosely occupies that part. And I'm oversimplifying radically, but you get the idea. It's got to be a cycle. It is a cycle, whether we think of it as a cycle or not. And of course, traditionally, we thought of it as linear, which is part of the problem. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. It's actually a lot more like this. What I've called social food networks, but where every element in this food's journey, food cycle, whatever you want to call it, has a relationship with every other stage of food's cycle, which is shaped and predicated and depending on things like habits, beliefs, skills, doctrines, rules, health and safety regulations, religion, you name it. Whether I like mummy's peas, all of that stuff is actually what shapes the food system. So what we're really talking about here is a hugely complex web of things that I think we can just loosely term food culture, because the food culture and everything that lies within it, our beliefs and our habits about food, our rituals to do with food, determine how we shape the world and our lives through food. Here are 4 examples of an absolutely fantastic study done by a New York Times journalist a few years ago. It's now come out as a book called Hungry World, where he just went round photographing families with a week's worth of their food supplies. So we have America, obviously. I always have to point out how nice the kids' grins are. But anyway, obviously they're sort of pizza-shaped mouths they've got because they sort of they stretch. But if you look at the amount of processed food in packets, just like that American housewife, from 50 years earlier, it's the same thing. It's all coming in packets from a long way away with a lot of writing on the outside and a lot of nasties on the inside. Of course, we're following in Britain, all the food trends in America are being followed in Britain just kind of, a few years behind. And that's everything from how much we cook, how much we eat out, and how fat we are. And, obviously how much packaged and pre-packaged food we eat. If you go to Egypt, obviously radical difference, huge amount more fresh food, seasonal food, unpackaged food that's obviously been produced locally, food that you imagine they might have actually known the chap or the woman that they bought the food from. And Italy, a kind of, in a way, a country in transition, a country that was the wrong kind of transition in this case, a country that we think of as being a bastion of wonderful, local food and peasant food and so on. But of course, it is no accident that the slow food movement began in Italy, because Italian cuisine, like all other European cuisines, is under threat from the inexorable march of the hamburger. And in fact, the slow food movement, as some of you probably know, began when a local communist cell, including Carlo Petrini, was so outraged that a McDonald's was opening on the Spanish Steps or opposite it in Rome that they set up some pasta bins. They cooked pasta and handed it out and said, you don't need that. CRAP, we've got this amazing fast food already in Italy. Anyway, and that's how it began. So a fantastic diet under threat. But anyway, through these pictures and ones like them, and you can see these on the web, and they really are fantastic, you can extrapolate a huge amount. You can extrapolate how much is food bound into sociability, how much do people sort of talk to one another through food, do they sit around tables and eat together, or do they sort of go off into their bedrooms and play Xbox? I don't actually know what Xbox is, but I know it exists and kids do it. And so on. So it is about food culture. So it's about how we eat. Do we eat like this? Do we have dogs that grin so winningly? But do we sit around tables? Do we talk to one another when we eat food? Do we have, women that sort of still grin like that after they've cooked a chicken? If we are going to eat like that, we have to have people like this. I don't mean people that wear sort of funny pinnies, but I mean people that can look at a pile of raw vegetables and know what they are, or what you might do with them, or what they might be called, or whether they're going to poison you to death, or whatever. Cooks, in other words. They can be men, they can be children. They can't be dogs, but they can be anyway. Because without cooks and without people caring about food, that's what I'm really talking about. I'm talking about valuing food. You can't have places like this, places where you actually go to buy food and you animate space in the city. You actually talk to other people. The food comes in, you see it, you smell it. So, ooh, I didn't realise that the grapes were ripe yet, and all this kind of stuff. Well, you wouldn't say that because you'd obviously know about things like that. But anyway, markets where there are people and food, real food, not food in packets. Because if we don't value food, we can't eat the landscape. We can't, if we are going to eat meat, I think we should eat meat, but I think we should only eat meat that is raised like this. In other words, raised extensively and expensively. Meat should be a condiment. It should be a complement to an organic way of producing food. It shouldn't be factory produced or mass produced and fed grain that we could be eating. This is what I call cows with a view. Because if we don't value food, we won't bother to do something constructive with the waste. Waste there's no such thing as waste, certainly not when it comes to food. It's all potential nutrient and energy that can go into other things. I mean, particularly good. I mean, it's no accident that through history, well, apart from in religions where it's forbidden, men have cohabited with pigs and chickens, because pigs and chickens eat what we eat. They're omnivores, and they therefore, you know, they're very, very good companions. They can eat the stuff we don't want to eat, and then we can eat them. I mean, you know, sounds a bit cruel, but it really works. And anyway, as I say, I mean, it's usually in times of deprivation like wars when people really start to value food properly because they don't have enough of it. This is an image from the Second World War. I always have to point out as well that it says, do not put in the bin rhubarb or potato tops, and that looks incredibly like rhubarb to me. But anyway, there you go. None of these solutions are easy. They all take working on, but, you know, again, they have to be worked on. Once you start to value food, they just become no-brainers. And of course, there are amazing examples globally of the way this has been done, is still being done. This is an image of basically urban, peri-urban farming in China, where there's been a long tradition of you collecting night soil, which is a polite word for excrements, human and animal, and taking it in carts. And basically dumping it in the suburbs. That's, of course, what they were doing all the time up to the industrialisation of the city in the first place. I mean, you know, all of those market gardens von Thunen was talking about. I mean, you know, there was a huge amount of money to be made in bringing the fruit and veg on just a few weeks ahead of season by growing it in shit with glass on top, effectively. That's what they did. Anyway, they were still doing it in China, but they're kind of abandoning these kinds of practices very quickly as they urbanise. Of course, you know, the famous Dig for Victory campaign, again during the Second World War, again exposing the latent fertility of cities. The very famous example of Cuba, I imagine most of you are familiar with, but anyway, just to say, you know, Cuba was kind of dumped in the proverbial when, you know, the Soviet Union collapsed because it was importing 90% of its calories from there. America, of course, immediately imposed a trade embargo, so there was this kind of necessity, convulsive, organic and urban and peri-urban agricultural revolution, made easier by the fact there's a communist government, so basically there was no issue over land ownership, going back to Inge's point about who owns the land and what's it for. And there are people around the world looking for radical solutions to the problem of feeding cities. This is one example. All the architects I know are sort of feverishly excited by this idea. In fact, Dixon des Pommiers, who is at the center of this vertical farming thing, takes no responsibility for any of these images whatsoever, and in fact is an epidemiologist. And in fact, it was a couple of his students that came up with this idea in the first place, but he thought it was quite good and ran with it. But architects just keep sending him in sort of their idea of a vertical farm, and he sort of decides which one isn't or is not a vertical farm and then publishes them on his website. But he is actually now looking into this for real. They haven't made the stats stack up yet, but you know, his argument is if we're going to feed cities, we have to bring food production back into the city. Personally, I don't think this works, but anyway, and restore the countryside to what he calls its ecological services and functions, which I do agree with. I just think this is a sort of radicalisation of the problem, but I think it's a useful radicalisation because it certainly gets people talking. Dongtan, a very, very famous, again among architects, sustainable city model designed by Arup, commissioned by the Shanghai Development Corporation a few years ago to go on an island called Chongming, just opposite Shanghai. All sorts of things like green roofs, food factories, filtration of city sewage to fertilize local farms, mixed-use, dense neighborhoods, so to minimize traveling from A to B and so on, which they estimated would reduce the ecological footprint of inhabitants of this city, Dongtan, by about half from a conventional city, so getting it down from about 5.6 global hectares to about 2.9. And everyone was extremely excited about this. The only problem is that design was completed about 3 years ago, and not a sod has been turned yet. It's still sitting, as it were, in the proverbial drawers of the Shanghai Development Corporation, who meanwhile has commissioned this, Greenport Shanghai, a 27-kilometre squared agro park consisting of enormous aircraft hangar-sized multi-storey factory farms with tomatoes on the top deck, fish underneath, and pigs underneath that. And then obviously the waste at the bottom, which is really secretly what they want to build, in my opinion. And it's being shown at the Shanghai Expo at the moment. And as I say, I was shocked, actually, that I shouldn't have been, when I discovered that this is on the same site as the Dongtan Eco-City project. Go figure. So this is, again, possibly an example of, if you try to build utopia, you don't get there. Maybe that's too utopian. Maybe we have to be going to more grassroots approaches. This is an interesting one. Detroit, city of car manufacturers, 2.5 million population. All of a sudden, oops, the global economy means that it's no longer going to make any sense to build cars in Detroit. All the jobs go, I won't say overnight again, but very quickly, kind of overnight actually, in this case, because they were all being employed by General Motors, who just moved out one day. This is what Detroit looks like now. There's an extraordinary film actually around called Requiem for Detroit, which I really, isn't it amazing? Really recommend. Anyway, talk about, yes, YouTube it apparently. Anyway. What's this city that suddenly has a third of its previous population? By the way, all the national supermarkets have abandoned Detroit. They just went. So there are no national networks of supermarkets in Detroit. The whole thing's one enormous food desert, basically. So they're going back to farming. That's the only thing you can do, really. So they have chains of farms like this, urban farms. They're sort of getting together, banding together to start getting productive again. They're re-inhabiting once abandoned wholesale markets with local food exchanges again. And they've got a special label called Grown in Detroit, so people will sort of recognize that this is local food and they'll pay more about it, and it gets the whole spirit going. Extraordinary. Basically, Zootopia, this idea of how you reinvent the way we live through food, is a very, very open question. I think it involves rethinking what a city is, certainly building large metropolitan blobs one side of the world and large animal gulags the other side, and then shipping the stuff around in aeroplanes clearly is bonkers. This is somebody's idea recently of what New York might look like once they've really greened it up, cows on roofs and things. Actually, New York is very, very quickly becoming the urban farming centre of the world. I mean, they're really, really heavily into this stuff. It's very interesting. But I don't know whether Zootopia looks like this. Actually, as I said, it's not necessarily a place. It's actually a way of thinking. And I have to say, I always talk, if I've got time, I always talk about transition towns, because to me, transition towns are a fantastic example of what I call Utopian thinking. Now, I know it's not just about food, and in a way I use food as a kind of conduit and a medium and a way of seeing, but the kind of thinking you're doing, how do we rethink what we already do through energy descent, through asking what a good life is, all these questions that for some bizarre reason we haven't been asking for decades, it seems, if centuries. So this idea of what a good life is, which is really my core question that I'm now trying to ask through food, is I think what you're doing, and it's just fantastic. I think the transition movement and also the way it's just gone viral, actually, is a perfect example of its non-utopianism as well. And I think that's its great strength. It's actually just getting on and doing stuff now, whatever scale you can, however you can. And I was very touched and moved when the first handbook you brought out was about food, because to me that is just a fantastic catalyst, and in a way that's how I came to food in the first place. It's just something we can't opt out of. It's something we can't decide is somebody else's problem, because it's something that we all share. So the communality of food, the fact that it brings people together, the fact that it's about identity, it's about soul, it's about love. I mean, I talk a lot about love now. It's quite liberating, actually. Anyway, all of those things that I would have gone into much more today if I'd have had time. But just to say, this is not a city, or as Magritte would have said, ceci n'est pas une cité or something. But anyway, that's a sort of weird, I don't know why I said that. This is actually a bit more like the reality of cities now, but it's completely unsustainable and bad. We need a model that looks a bit more like this. Now, I mean, I would again like to talk a lot more about permaculture, because I think, I know that's something that you also do in the transition movement, is to sort of think about the way we live as a permaculture. I absolutely think that's the right approach. I mean, this is just a provocation, really. I mean, this is me superimposing Shanghai on top of some rainforest and saying, actually, if we really want to live sustainably, we have to rethink our lives more according to the principles of the rainforest, which of course is, you know, the best example we have of a resilient permaculture. We are what we eat, we all know that. I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that the world is what we eat, how we eat, who we eat it with, how we value food, and how we sort of manifest our idea of what a good life is through the way we think of food and think through food. We have an incredibly powerful tool, conceptual tool, a practical tool, and above all a shared communal tool that we can really make a difference and make a better world with. Thank you very much. He obviously just barks at the beginning and the end. Thank you.